Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. And for Fish and Wildlife, this lecture we're going to talk about capturing techniques. Now some of these techniques might be really familiar to you because of shows like um, uh, Deadliest Catch or Crab Fisherman, or I don't know what they call all these shows, but there's a lot of shows where they show jobs of fishermen or fishing jobs because really they're very dangerous jobs. The ocean is unpredictable, and therefore any job on the ocean is unpredictable. So we'll talk about some techniques like crab pots or capturing techniques like these passive techniques. We'll talk about techniques of using seines and netting and things like that in aquatic systems. But we'll also talk about terrestrial techniques, and I'll kind of give you the pros and cons of the techniques and a little bit of what they're used for from a scientific point of view. Now, I'm not going to cover all the techniques in great detail because some of the techniques, not even I myself have used before. So the ones that I have not used, I won't be able to tell you, the exact rigging or um, in some cases the exact dosage of maybe a chemical or something like that that you would use as a tranquilizer, etc. I've used tranks, but we'll get into that in a second. So some of them I'll just kind of skim over and let you know, hey, these traps are out there, or these techniques, capturing techniques are out there. Um, and whatnot. And others I'll go into great detail. And in fact, I'll even have separate videos that will show you the technique in use. So um, remember that a lot of these capturing techniques, either you have to have a collection permit as a scientist, or you have to be, you know, it has to be legal to use the method as a hunter or fisherman. Okay. And so we'll go through these. So I have that kind of caveat because I don't want you guys to go out there and say, oh, well, I'm just going to use this trap to collect a bunch of fish or collect mammals and things like that, when in fact it's not legal to use that unless you have a collecting permit. So I'm going to show you some of these techniques, but realize I have collecting permits and I can utilize these techniques, but you alone cannot. But maybe in the future, if you get a collection permit or if you're part of an industry that has one. Okay, so first off, I want to talk about a couple things. There are two types of capturing techniques, two broad categories. One in which we call passive techniques. And so a passive technique is a sit and wait technique. Okay, so you put something out there. Sometimes it's baited. Sometimes it's just, a hit or miss kind of technique where if the organism's in the region, it's going to get captured. If it's not in the region, you're not going to capture it, that kind of thing. Those are passive techniques. So, yes, there's a little bit of activeness to set them up, but then after that, they do the collecting on their own. Okay, so we'll talk about passive techniques, um, and then we're going to talk about the other type of technique, and that's active techniques, in which you're actively seeking out regions or actively utilizing energy to capture organisms. Okay, and we'll get at that in a second. Okay. So first of all, there's entanglement traps that are passive. So things like this picture here of this shark with the net around its kind of gill area. This is called a gill net, and gill nets are utilized. I mean, every day in all bodies of water, pretty much in the world, to capture fish. It's extremely good method to capture fish. Um, there's problems with it. in that it's not selective. So what I mean by selective technique, it doesn't select what organism or what organisms are being captured. Okay? In some cases, it can select a size category. So you have a certain size of organism that can be captured, and all the other organisms should be able to swim through. But nonetheless, it's not selecting, for males or females. It's not selecting for certain species. It's just selecting for size. Okay, so there's problems with that. You get a lot of bycatch or organisms that you might not want. Okay, and also the other problem is often gill nets are lethal. Okay, there are other types of entanglement nets for fishing called trammel nets, which have a pocket that the fish falls into, and they're less lethal. But again, it's a passive technique that is not selecting for a certain organism or might be only selecting for a certain size. Okay, here's another picture of an entanglement. This is a terrestrial entanglement. It works a similar way to the gill net, except for the organism is often not killed. It's entangled in a net. Okay, these are called mist nets. Okay, and often, well, always they should be used for birds. Okay, and so birds will fly into them. They can't see them. They get entangled in the net, and then a researcher can get the bird out of the net. Now, they do become lethal if the individual is not there to remove the bird from the net. That happens. And in some parts of the world, these nets are used, mist nets are used as a lethal mechanism to capture food resources. Okay, but researchers use them typically to capture organisms to study them. And you'll see this, I'll demonstrate this method in a later video. Okay. Entrapment, okay, entrapment can happen in many different forms. There's tons of traps out there, different types of traps. Some, like this one here, is called a funnel trap. Okay, there's a funnel here and a funnel here, and the organisms swim through but can't swim back out. Pretty simple concept. This is often called a minnow trap. But regardless, funnel traps can be much bigger than just for minnows. From an aquatic standpoint, this is how a lot of crab pots work. This is how lobster traps work. Lots of traps have this kind of funnel technique, or what we call a ledge technique, where they'll come up and they'll walk off the ledge into the trap, and then they can't climb back out. Regardless of whether it's a funnel and they swim through or they walk off the edge, the premise is the same. Okay? The organism gets into the trap, they can't get out. Now, sometimes entrapments, you entice the organism with something to eat, okay? Or you entice them with something that they're curious about. Okay? So here you can see this is a snare trap. Okay? Often snare traps will not entice an organism with food, but entice them with something else. Sometimes people will like hang a feather from a string, which will entice cats and things like that to approach the trap region. Sometimes there's food nearby, and so if you're trying to entrap coyotes or a scavenger or something like that, sometimes a rotting carcass might be in the region. Other times it's just a snare that's in a region that organisms move back and forth, and you're going to capture that organism. Okay, most of the time these traps are actually not lethal, and they just trap the organism's paw or leg or whatever. And often, if they're done right, there's spacers in here so it doesn't break the organism's leg. So in actuality, you could come by and open this up, and the organism would be fine and could walk away. If it's breaking the leg, I don't want to say the trap is set up incorrectly. Some people like to set traps different ways. Um, but if it breaks the leg, then you do have the tendency of certain organisms, depending on the organism that you capture, they do have the tendency to gnaw off their leg. Okay, so if the bone is broken, then the organism will bite through it because it becomes numb. They'll bite through their leg and they'll leave the leg in the trap and then escape. So a lot of trappers don't like to have it break their leg. So there's spacers in there that just hold the leg in there, even though most of the time snare traps and things like that are lethal. The purpose is to capture the organism and then to shoot the organism or dispose of the organism. Okay? The trap itself is often not lethal. Okay? Angling. So there's different types of fishing techniques. Some are passive, like using trot lines and um, bait lines, those kind of things. Um, Even some people would consider bait fishing uh, kind of a passive technique, since you cast out with a worm and bobber and you just leave it sit there or whatever. Um, they can be considered passive techniques. Angling can also be considered an active technique, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And then drugs. So you can have bait piles that have drugs on them. You can have regions, where you might put out uh, a certain toxin or whatever, and organisms that come in contact with that are drugged, either lethal or non-lethal drugs. So it's not always lethal, but normally when it's on bait piles and things like that, it's a lethal drug. There are other types of drugs that are non-lethal, and the purpose is to maybe sterilize organisms. They would be a passive technique also, often put on bait piles and things like that. So there are situations where it's not a lethal drug. Okay, so entanglement, we already kind of hit on some of these. Um, there's a gill net. Here's a trammel net. These are aquatic nets. Okay, this one catches the organism, its head goes through, and then it gets caught in the larger portion of the body. Okay, so fish are normally fusiform or torpedo shaped, and so the head is skinny enough to get through, but the body itself won't. And then when they try to back out, it gets caught around their gills. Trammel nets work in a kind of similar form. They swim through, but there's a little pouch with a smaller netting on the other side, and they fall into that pouch and they get entrapped. Okay. Mist nets, I already kind of talked about this, and I'll demonstrate this one to you guys. They fall into this kind of net pouch, and I'll show you that, and the bird's captured and can't get out. Okay, Balchetry traps are entanglement traps that are normally used for predators, because you bait these traps typically with something like a small mouse or small rodent, and the top of the trap, you can sort of see it here in this picture. The top of the trap has a bunch of monofilament lines, and basically they're actually monofilament nooses, little teeny nooses that have been tied on top of the trap in monofilament line or fishing line. The bird will come down and try to get the prey, normally a mouse or something like that. The mouse or whatnot is in a bottom cage underneath the top cage, so often the mouse is not hurt at all. And I'll show you one of these traps. I have some Balchetry traps. I might throw a couple out and see if I capture them. Sometimes it's difficult in the fall to get predators to come to these, but I'll probably throw some out and see if I can capture something. But anyways, the predator would come down, get their feet entangled in the monofilament line, and then the trap is weighted so they couldn't pack it away, and then you can just go and grab the organism. Again, there's lots of other passive entanglement traps, nest traps, tree traps. There's lots of different traps out there, and I'm just showing you a few examples of those. Okay, so entrapment, there's quite a few aquatic ones, like we kind of talked about on the previous slides. Hoop nets, okay, it's a funnel system, so they'll go through the initial funnel and they get into the trap and then they can't really find their way out, or they can't fit back through the funnel. Now, whether or not the hoop net itself has what we call a cod end, it just depends on the type of hoop net or type of fyke net or whatever net we're talking about. Again, these nets are often pounded into the ground underneath the water, and it captures whatever fish or organism, aquatic organism that's in the water that can swim through these. Okay. Sometimes there's a cod end. Now, what I mean by a cod end is it's an end where there's a funnel and then there's another funnel. The second funnel or second region, okay, would have a opening or a zipper or something like that. So you don't have to remove the entire net, and you can just remove the back end, okay, to capture the organism. Okay, and so this is very common with trap nets and fyke nets, and sometimes, depending on the size of the hoop, a hoop net will have one also. Okay, and then there's all kinds of gear. Okay, so potting gear, minnow traps, crab pots, lobster traps, etc., that work in kind of a similar fashion. Some type of maze or some type of entrance that they can go through. Then they can't find that entrance again, or they get caught in one of these regions where they just can't get out, and that's kind of how pot gear works. Now, for terrestrial organisms, there are similar structures. Okay, you can get leg snares and things like that. Like you can see, this zebra here has been snared or was leg snared. Okay, which are often just cables or something like that that the organism steps on, and it will, capture them by the leg. There are many different techniques, many different types. The material used can be very abrasive, like cables, to things that are less abrasive, like ropes and whatnot. Snap traps, of course, there are lots of snap traps for different purposes. Normally, they're lethal. Okay, so they're baited, and mice traps, rat traps. That's what this is a trap, that was used for mice, but it captured a chipmunk. Again, these are a lot of these techniques, majority of these techniques, because they're not active and they're passive techniques, they're not, what the species that is captured is not determined by the trap. Now, you try to determine it by maybe the size of the opening or the food, the bait that you put in it, okay, the region that maybe you set it up. Those all try to limit bycatch. But nonetheless, you get bycatch in every one of these types of traps. Box traps, most of you have probably seen these. Here's three kind of raccoon cubs that have been captured in a box trap. Very, very common for non-lethal mechanisms to capture organisms like raccoons and skunks and things like that may become lethal. It might become a lethal technique depending on what you capture, but because it's a passive technique and it's not species determinate, you could always come by and say, oops, I caught 3 raccoons. I like raccoons. I'm going to release these organisms. Maybe you're trying to catch a skunk or something like that that you were going to kill off. Okay. All right. Other passive techniques from the fisheries point of view come in different ways of fishing or angling. Okay, so you can have things like trot lines and long lines, and it really just depends on the organism that you're after, what line system you might set up. But here you can see this kind of old photograph, and this is with trot line on the James River. Okay, there's no date here, but it's an old photograph. And this is what they were capturing. Again, it's a passive technique that does not select for species. So you have a bunch of catfish here, and then it looks like you have some warm water fish. They look like bass to me here. And then you have some suckers here, and you have some turtles. And so again, it is, a passive technique, not species determinant. Um, Depending on what you bait the lines with will determine what's going to eat that. But often you get a lot of capture and very different sizes, etc., and whatnot. This is kind of how you set up a trot line. Often you will have just a line that's got numerous hooks. The hooks are baited with something. Uh, and then you have some type of weight. Sometimes they're set in a V like this. Other times they're set on a long line, which means that you just have floats along the line that keeps them at the same depth or similar depth, and you would just tie it off on one end with maybe a weight and a larger float, and then you just run it across the system and tie it off with a weight and a float so the line doesn't move. Trot lines are often tied off kind of to the bank. So you might be working on a river system and you might tie it off on one tree on a bank and another tree on the bank, and you work the entire width of the stream or the body of water. Again, there are, problems with this technique for sure because of bycatch. You never know what you're going to capture. You can capture endangered species this way, etc. But there's also benefits to this. You can set a lot of trot lines or a lot of long lines in a system and remove a lot of fish if that's the goal of the project, or of maybe that's the goal of the fisheries group. Trot lines are used currently in commercial fisheries, so are long lines. And so if the goal is to capture a lot of fish, this is a good way to do it. Although the bycatch rate is still pretty high, and you don't get to determine what that bycatch is. And it's lethal. Okay, so once the organism's hooked, pretty much the organism gets hooked and it will die. Okay, passive and active when it comes to drugs. Okay, you can have an active tranquilizer where you're actively going out and selecting an organism to trank with that tranquilizer, or you can use oral drugs, and they can have tranquilizing effects. So alpha chloros has a tranquilizing effect. So you put it out on bait piles, etc. Organisms eat it. It makes them go to sleep, and then you can collect the organisms. There are lots of other oral drugs, some of which are extremely lethal. So maybe the purpose of it is to kill any organism that would eat that type of bait. So then you put lethal drugs out. Some are sterilants, so they sterilize the organism. So maybe the purpose is to sterilize all males because the population is too large. So you put out those oral drugs in hopes that they'll eat that, become sterile, and won't be able to reproduce. These are fairly common methods with different organisms in different regions. All right, so active techniques, again, this is actively seeking out at least a certain region, maybe not a certain species, okay? So lots of different types. There's trawls, dredges, nets, and then individually operated equipment, like hunting. So here you can see a bunch of hunters and truckloads of snow geese. Okay, whoops. So that's individually operated equipment. Okay, shotgun, whatever, maybe electric calls, these kind of things to get the organism to come in. But this is probably a purse net or something like that, which captured all these organisms. And if you're actively seeking just shrimp, okay, then you're kind of in trouble in a situation like this, because you've caught puffers, you've got lots of different types of like sea bass, and even caught some rays. I mean, you have a whole bunch of bycatch here in which it looks like they're all dead. So, and often that happens. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay, so actively capturing when it comes to trawls. Trawl is normally drug behind a boat, okay, some type of boat, and it will have what we call, different trawls have different names. So if it's called a beam trawl, it will often have these boards, these beam boards on each side, which keep the net open, and then a drag line, which is weighted with lead weights typically, and then a float line that goes across the top. Okay? And this is drug across the bottom, and it's capturing all the organisms in that region. Okay? Otter trawls are very similar to beam trawls. Okay, sometimes they'll have an otter board that occurs in the middle, okay, which keeps this net open. Other times they'll have these otter boards on each side, which are a little different design, okay, and that will keep that open. But again, similar premise: lead line, float line, drag it. Okay, midwater trawls. The lead line is often not as pronounced. It's not as heavy, so the trawl itself does not rest on the bottom, and your goal is actually to sample the midwater column. But again, you'd have otter boards or beam boards that would open that net and allow you to kind of go through the water. Now, depending on the size, most of the time, if it's commercial fishery or even a scientific vessel, these cables are all hooked to an electric reel, which would reel this net back in after you've done a certain distance pass, or after the net reaches a certain poundage. Sometimes there's a third line that grabs onto the middle of the lead line that would also be on that reel and drag it in to keep that purse or keep that seine open. Again, like I said before, even though this is an active technique, the bycatch is tremendous. You're actively sampling a region, but you're not actively sampling a certain organism. So you can have all kinds of bycatch in these trawl samples, of which sometimes the organisms are still alive and it can be tossed back into the water, but often the organisms are dead and they just get tossed back in the water dead, and you've just terminated a numerous amount of organisms, of which none of them are you very much interested in because they're not food resources, or maybe they're too small to be food resources. It's a very similar technique, dredges, okay, to the trawls, except for dredges actually scrape the bottom with a dredging plate. So depending on whether you're sampling oysters or scallops, it will depend on what kind of plate is used. Is it an actual metal plate that is, scraping across the oyster bed? Or is there little like hooks, like finger talons that kind of dig up the material and scrape across the bottom, kicking the material into the back end of the net? Okay. Again, like I said before, these techniques, even though they're active, you're actively dragging it behind the boat. There's a lot of potential for collecting organisms that are not of interest, either too small, or not the right species, or they're fish, they're starfish, something like that. In some cases, they're tossed back in hopes that they will live, or they're tossed back and the nutrients are returned to the ocean in the form of dead organism. All right, so there's other active techniques with nets, and these are typically, again, they're not selective, so they're not selecting for a certain species, but in some cases, you're able to release the organism because you're not dislodging the organism, and the organism's still alive. Okay? Especially like beach seines. So here you can see huge group of people running a huge beach seine. Okay, and what they're going to do is, much like the picture here, they're going to walk this seine out in kind of a U shape and then drag it up to the beach. Okay, and with this many people, okay, it's probably fairly easy for one to say that you could throw a lot of fish back that you're not interested in. Okay, this is a research class, but when you drag that in, okay, if there's organisms that are endangered, threatened, okay, or you're just not interested in them, they can be tossed back into the water fairly quickly, and the organism should live. Okay. In the case of a purse seine, that's what this is. So the boat just goes in a very large circle across the top, and then the seine has a drawstring at the bottom, which is hooked to a cable, and that cable is hooked to a motor and can be drawn. And so basically, you draw up the purse and you capture all the organisms in that water column. So depending on the size of the ship, depending on the size of the net, etc., the size of the reel, okay, you can sample a huge water column this way. Now, because it takes quite a bit of time to set this up and to draw this up, less organisms are probably going to be able to be tossed back. But for large organisms, okay, in the case of things like dolphins and turtles and things like that, often if they're captured in a purse seine, they can live. They can be thrown back in the water and survive. Okay, this is another example of a seine method, which we call a cod seine, which is very similar to a purse seine, but it's kind of just drugged through the water, and you have a large cod end, which all the fish get just crammed into, and then it can all be drawn onto the boat, and then the fish can be picked through. Now, again, some of the bycatch in these cases, because this is a longer method than, say, a beach seine or even a purse seine, some of the bycatch, excuse me, will die. Some will live, but again, you're sampling entire water column. This is a active technique that is not species specific. Okay? Net guns are exactly what they sound like. You have a net that's hooked up to a charge, and that can be fired over an organism. Now, often net guns are species specific. Now, occasionally they'll catch bycatch, but net guns have been set up in many different regions. So you have food plots, and you can shoot a net over the organisms that are coming in. At dumps or other regions where you might have a lot of gulls, a lot of ravens, a lot of crows that come in, and maybe you're interested in studying these organisms, you can shoot a gun over them or shoot a net over them and capture them, and then go sample them. Pelicans, things that are breeding on islands, net guns are really good for that because you can actively sample a lot of organisms, but it's pretty species specific. Now, occasionally there might be an organism that's in there that you don't want, okay, because they're just nesting with those other organisms or they're coming into that food plot with those other organisms. But it's far less than, say, even beach seines or purse seines or cod seines. It's far less bycatch because you're actively seeking these organisms out. Okay? Now, other ways to actively seek out organisms is individually operated equipment. Now, most of the time, this is species specific. So you can just sample them with dip nets. So you could just use a net to sample organisms, and then if it's not the organism you want, you just drop it back in. It's not a big deal. The organism normally lives. Lift nets, so you can sample certain regions. So you have a net on the bottom of a body of water, and you can just pick up the net, and it captures that region, those organisms, that region. Okay. Again, easily bycatch can easily be removed in most lift net cases. Angling, again, can be done by, fly fishing. It can be done by bait fishing, and as long as you're actively fishing, okay, those organisms can be removed, and majority of the time, they're perfectly fine if that technique is done correctly. Electrofishing, you can see a picture here where you have an anode and a cathode, and you're dropping an electrical charge into the water, which will stun the fish and cause them to float to the surface. Okay, the organism is then captured via a net. If the organism is not what you want or what you're looking for, that organism can be dropped outside of the electrical current, and then they'll come back to and swim away. As long as the individual running the backpack shocker or the boat shocker has the current set correctly, okay, most organisms are not permanently damaged. Hunting, okay, this is species specific and lethal. Okay, so the organism is not released, but the organism is, of interest is the organism that is taken. Trapping, same kind of thing. You can trap lethal or non-lethal. You can actively trap by, pushing organisms into a trap. Okay? Or you can set up seines and do what we call walk seines, and so you can be moving organisms into a region or push organisms with helicopters and things into traps. Depending on the trapping technique, sometimes it's non-lethal, sometimes it's lethal. Okay, so those are the passive and active techniques of capture that I want to go over. Now, some of them I'm going to show you a demonstration of the technique, and that will be combined with the next lecture, which I'm going to talk about marking techniques, because a lot of these capturing techniques, the goal of capturing the organism is to mark them. Okay, and once you mark an organism, depending on the mark that you put on them, you can then do a lot of things with that organism. You can get, well, what's that organism's growth rate if we recapture that organism? What's the population estimate for that population of organisms? Okay, where's that organism going? Okay, where's that organism overwinter? Where's that organism go in the spring? There's a lot of reasons to mark an organism, and depending on the mark that you put on them will depend on what the purpose of that technique was. Same thing with capturing. Okay, what do you want to do with the organism? Do you want to remove the organism from the population? Then lethal techniques are perfectly fine. Do you want the organism to be as in as perfect condition as possible? Then a non-lethal, non-abrasive technique would be utilized. Okay? And so the reason for the capturing technique will depend on what the purpose of the research is or purpose of the capture is. Okay, is it for food resources? Is it to sample the population, etc.? All right, so next time we'll talk about marking techniques, and then you can expect to see things like video demonstrations of misnetting, okay, video demonstrations of using Sherman traps or live traps, okay, and hopefully I'll get a Balchetry trap video up also, okay, just depends on what's around. Okay, until next time.